Respiratory physiology. Diagnosis and treatment of most respiratory disorders depend heavily on the understanding of the basic physiological principles of respiration and gas exchange. Some respiratory diseases result from inadequate ventilation, others result from abnormalities of diffusion through the pulmonary membrane or abnormal transport of gases between the lungs and tissues. Therapy is often entirely different for these diseases, so it is no longer satisfactory to simply make a diagnosis of respiratory insufficiency. So, we've discussed already several methods for studying respiratory abnormalities, including measuring the vital capacity, tidal air, functional residual capacity, dead space, physiological shunt, and physiological dead space. This array of measurements is only part of the armamentarium of the clinical pulmonary physiologist. Some other tools are described now. Coming to the study of blood gases and blood pH, among the most fundamental of all tests of pulmonary performance are determinations of the blood partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide, PCO2, PO2, and also pH. It is often important to make these measurements rapidly as an aid in determining appropriate therapy for acute respiratory distress or acute abnormalities in acid-base balance. Coming to the determination of blood pH, it is measured using a glass pH electrode of the type commonly used in chemical laboratories. However, the electrodes used for this purpose are miniaturized. The voltage generated by the glass electrode is a direct measure of pH, and this is generally read directly from a voltmeter scale or it is recorded on a chart. Coming to the determination of blood carbon dioxide, a glass electrode pH meter can also be used to determine blood CO2. When a weak solution of sodium bicarbonate is exposed to carbon dioxide gas, the carbon dioxide gas dissolves in the solution until an equilibrium state is established. In this equilibrium state, the pH of the solution is a function of the carbon dioxide dissolved. Okay, it is a function of the carbon dioxide and bicarbonate ion concentrations in accordance with the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, that is pH is equal to 6.1 plus log HCO3 minus by CO2. So when the glass electrode is used to measure CO2 in blood, a miniature glass electrode is surrounded by a thin plastic membrane. In the space between the electrode and the plastic membrane, a solution of sodium bicarbonate of known concentration is placed. Okay, so if this is the glass electrode and this is the plastic membrane, in the space between these two, sodium bicarbonate, a known solution is placed. Okay, and blood is then superfused onto the outer surface of the plastic membrane, allowing CO2 to diffuse from the blood into the bicarbonate solution. Only a drop or so of blood is required. Next, the pH is measured by the glass electrode and the CO2 is calculated with the use of the formula that was previously provided. Coming to the determination of blood PO2, the concentration of O2 in a fluid can be measured by a technique called polarography. Electric current is made to flow between a small negative electrode and the solution. If the voltage of the electrode is more than minus 0.6 volts different from the voltage of the solution, O2 will deposit on the electrode. Furthermore, the rate of current flow through the electrode will be directly proportional to the concentration of O2 and therefore to PO2 as well. In practice, a negative platinum electrode with a surface area of about 1 millimeter square is used. And this electrode is separated from the blood by a thin plastic membrane that allows diffusion of O2 but will not allow diffusion of proteins or other substances that will poison the electrode. Often, all three of the measuring devices for pH, CO2, and PO2 are built into the same apparatus, and all these measurements can be made within a minute or so using a single droplet size sample of blood. Thus, changes in the blood gases and pH can be followed almost moment by moment at the bedside. Coming to the pathophysiology of specific pulmonary abnormalities, first let's talk about chronic pulmonary emphysema. The term pulmonary emphysema literally means excess air in the lungs. However, this term is used to describe a complex obstructive and destructive process of the lungs caused by many years of smoking. So it results from the major pathophysiological changes in the lungs. First, chronic infection caused by inhaling smoke or other substances that irritate the bronchi and the bronchioles. The chronic infection seriously deranges the normal protective mechanisms of the airways, including partial paralysis of the cilia of the respiratory system, an effect which is caused by nicotine. Okay? So as a result, the mucus cannot be moved easily out of the passageways. And also stimulation of excess mucus secretion occurs, which further exacerbates the condition. Okay, so your nicotine, it makes the cilia immotile, so your mucus cannot be moved. Also, there is increase in the rate of mucus production as well. Now, inhibition of the alveolar macrophages also occurs, so they become less effective in combating infection. The infection, excess mucus, and the inflammatory edema of the bronchiolar epithelium together cause chronic obstruction of many of the smaller airways. The obstruction of the airways makes it especially difficult to expire. Please remember one thing, this is my trick to remember this. In obstructive diseases, you are obstructing the outflow. In restrictive diseases, you are restricting the inflow. Obstructive outflow, you are obstructing the outflow, that is why expiration is difficult. So the obstruction of the airways makes it especially difficult to expire, thus causing entrapment of air in the alveoli and overstretching them. This effect, combined with the lung infection, causes marked destruction of as much as 50 to 80% of the alveolar walls. Okay, so once again, let's go through the flowchart. Nicotine damages cilia, so they cannot move your mucus, and at the same time, more mucus is secreted. At the same time, alveolar macrophages are inhibited, and all of these cause chronic obstruction, and expiration becomes difficult. Because you are not able to expire optimally, air becomes entrapped in the alveoli, overstretching them, and in this way, 50 to 80% of the alveolar wall gets destroyed. So in this picture, you can see the final picture of the emphysematous lung, okay, in which you can also see that most of the walls, they coalesce, okay. So that is what happens. Alright, so the physiological effects of chronic emphysema are variable depending on the severity of the disease and the relative degrees of bronchiolar obstruction versus lung parenchymal obstruction. Among the different abnormalities are the following. The bronchiolar obstruction increases airway resistance and results in greatly increased work of breathing. It is especially difficult for the person to move air through the bronchioles during expiration because the compressive force on the outside of the lung not only compresses the alveoli but also compresses the bronchioles, which further increases their resistance during expiration. The marked loss of alveolar walls greatly decreases the diffusing capacity of the lung because you are losing the surface area, which reduces the ability of the lungs to oxygenate the blood and remove carbon dioxide from the blood. The obstructive process is frequently much worse in some parts of the lungs than in other parts, so some portions of the lungs are well ventilated whereas other portions are poorly ventilated. This situation often causes extremely abnormal VQ ratios, leading to very few ventilation perfusion ratios in some parts, that is causing physiological shunting, and in some parts, and very high VA by Q in other parts, that is causing physiological dead spaces in other parts, resulting in wasted ventilation. Loss of large portions of the alveolar walls also decreases the number of pulmonary capillaries through which blood can pass. As a result, pulmonary vascular resistance often increases markedly, causing pulmonary hypertension, which in turn overloads the right side of the heart and frequently causes right-sided heart failure. Chronic emphysema usually progresses slowly over many years. Both hypoxia and hypercapnia develop because of hypoventilation of many alveoli plus the loss of alveolar walls. The net result of all these effects is severe, prolonged, devastating air hunger or dyspnea that can last for years until the hypoxia and hypercapnia cause death, a high penalty to pay for smoking. Coming to pneumonia, the term pneumonia includes any inflammatory condition of the lung in which some or all the alveoli are lined with fluid and red blood cells, as you can see here. Some or all the alveoli are lined with fluid and blood vessels, are filled with fluid and blood vessels. A common cause of pneumonia is bacterial pneumonia. A common type of pneumonia is bacterial pneumonia, which is caused most frequently by pneumococci. This disease begins with infection in the alveoli. The pulmonary membrane becomes inflamed and highly porous, so that fluid and even RBCs and WBCs leak out of the blood into the alveoli. Thus, the infected alveoli become progressively more filled with fluid and cells, and the infection spreads by extension of bacteria or virus from the alveolus to alveolus. Eventually, large areas of the lungs, sometimes the whole lobes or even a whole lung, become consolidated, which means that they are filled with fluid and cellular debris. So in persons with pneumonia, the gas exchange functions of the lungs decline in different stages of the disease. In early stages, the pneumonia process might be well localized to only one lung, with alveolar ventilation reduced while blood flow through the lung continues normally. This condition causes two major pulmonary abnormalities: reduction in the total available surface area of the respiratory membrane and decreased ventilation perfusion ratio. Both of these effects cause hypoxemia and hypercapnia. So this figure shows the effect of the decreased ventilation perfusion ratio in pneumonia. The blood passing through the aerated lung becomes 97% saturated with oxygen, whereas that passing through the unaerated lung is only about 60% saturated. Okay, so therefore the average saturation of the blood pumped by the left heart into the aorta is only about 78%, which is far below the normal. Coming to atelectasis, It means collapse of the alveoli. It can occur in localized areas of a lung or in an entire lung. Common causes of atelectasis are total obstruction of the airway or lack of surfactant in the fluids lining the alveoli. The airway obstruction type of atelectasis usually results from blockage of many small bronchi with mucus or obstruction of a major bronchus by either a large mucus plug or some solid object such as a tumor. The air entrapped beyond the block is absorbed within minutes to hours by the blood flowing in the pulmonary capillaries. Okay, so the air entrapped beyond the block, okay, if this is the block, beyond the block, it is absorbed into the pulmonary capillaries. Alright, if the lung tissue is pliable enough, this will simply lead to collapse of the alveoli. However, because air is just entering into this, there is negative pressure, it collapses. However, if the lung is rigid because of fibrotic tissue and cannot collapse, absorption of air from the alveoli creates very negative pressures within the alveoli, and this pulls fluid out of the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli, causing the alveoli to fill completely with edematous fluid. Because this negative pressure is caused, it causes fluid to fill up in the alveoli. Okay, it causes the alveoli to completely fill up with edematous fluid. This process almost always is the effect that occurs when an entire lung becomes atelectatic, a condition called massive collapse of the lung. So the effects of overall pulmonary function caused by massive atelectasis of a lung are shown here in this figure. So collapse of the lung tissue not only occludes the alveoli but also increases the resistance to blood flow through the pulmonary vessels of the collapsed lung. This resistance increase occurs partially because of the lung collapse, which compresses and folds the vessels as the volume of the lungs decreases. Alright, so in addition, hypoxia in the collapsed alveoli also causes additional vasoconstriction. Because of the vascular constriction, blood flow through the atelectatic lung is greatly reduced. Fortunately, most of the blood is routed through the ventilated lung and therefore becomes well aerated. So in this figure, 5/6 of the blood passes through the aerated lung and only 1/6 passes through the unaerated lung. As a result, the overall ventilation perfusion ratio is only moderately compromised, so the aortic blood has only mild oxygen desaturation despite total loss of ventilation in an entire lung. Coming to lack of surfactant as a cause of lung collapse. Surfactant is secreted by special alveolar epithelial type 2 pneumocytic cells into the fluids that coat the inside surface of the alveoli. The surfactant in turn decreases the surface tension in the alveoli 2 to 10-fold, which normally plays a major role in preventing alveolar collapse. However, in several conditions such as hyaline membrane disease, also called respiratory distress syndrome, which occurs in newborn premature babies, the quantity of surfactant secreted by the alveoli is so greatly depressed that the surface tension of the alveolar fluid becomes several times the normal. This situation causes a serious tendency for the lungs of these babies to collapse or to become filled with fluid. Okay, so many of these infants die of suffocation when large portions of the lungs become atelectatic. Now, coming to asthma, it means spasmodic contraction of the smooth muscles in the bronchioles. Asthma is characterized by spastic contraction of the smooth muscle in the bronchioles, which partially obstructs the bronchioles and causes extremely difficult breathing. It occurs in 3 to 5% of all people at some time in life. The usual cause of asthma is contractile hypersensitivity of the bronchioles in response to foreign substances in the air. In about 70% of patients younger than the age of 30 years, the asthma is caused by allergic hypersensitivity, especially sensitivity to plant pollen. In older people, the cause is almost always hypersensitivity to non-allergenic types of irritants in the air, such as irritants in the smoke. So basically, in asthma, there is smooth muscle contraction, spasmodic contraction of the smooth muscles in the bronchiolar walls because of an exaggerated allergic response. Okay, so the typical allergic person tends to form abnormally large amounts of immunoglobulin E, IgE antibodies in allergy, and these antibodies can cause allergic reactions when they react with the specific antigens that have caused them to develop in the first place. In persons with asthma, these antibodies are mainly attached to mast cells that are present in the lung interstitium in close association with bronchioles and small bronchi. When an asthmatic person breathes in pollen to which he or she is sensitive, the pollen reacts with mast cell attached antibodies and causes the mast cells to release several different substances. Among them are histamine, slow reacting substance of anaphylaxis, which is a mixture of leukotrienes, and eosinophilic chemotactic factor and bradykinin. The combined effects of all these factors, especially the slow reacting substance of anaphylaxis, are to produce localized edema in the walls of small bronchioles, as well as secretion of thick mucus into the bronchiolar lumens and spasm of the bronchiolar smooth muscle. Therefore, the airway resistance increases greatly. So the bronchiolar diameter becomes more reduced during expiration than during inspiration in persons with asthma. So it is also obstructive disease. As a result of bronchiolar collapse during expiratory effort that compresses the outsides of the bronchioles. Because the bronchioles of the asthmatic lungs are already partially occluded, further occlusion resulting from the external pressure creates especially severe obstruction during expiration. That is, the asthmatic person often can inspire quite adequately but has difficulty expiring. Clinical measurements show greatly reduced maximum expiratory rate and reduced timed expiratory volume. Also, all of this altogether results in dyspnea or air hunger. The FRC and the RV of the lung become especially increased during an acute asthma attack because of the difficulty in expiring air from the lungs. Also, over a period of years, the chest cage becomes permanently enlarged, causing a barrel chest, and both the functional residual capacity and the lung residual volume become permanently increased. Now coming to tuberculosis. In tuberculosis, the tubercle bacilli cause a peculiar tissue reaction in the lungs, including invasion of the infected tissue by macrophages and walling off of the lesion by fibrous tissue to form the so-called tubercle. This walling off process, it helps to form walls around the infected areas and helps to limit further transmission of the tubercle bacilli in the lungs and is therefore a part of the protective process against extension of the infection. However, in about 3% of all people in whom tuberculosis develops, if the disease is not treated, the walling off process fails and the tubercle bacilli spread throughout the lungs, often causing extreme destruction of lung tissue with formation of large abscess cavities. Thus, tuberculosis in its late stages is characterized by many areas of fibrosis throughout the lungs as well as reduced total amount of functional lung tissue. These effects include increased work on the part of the respiratory muscles to cause pulmonary ventilation and reduce vital capacity and breathing capacity, reduce total respiratory membrane surface area and increased thickness of the respiratory membrane, causing progressively diminished pulmonary diffusing capacity, and abnormal ventilation perfusion ratio in the lungs, further reducing overall pulmonary diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Coming to pleural effusion, it is a condition in which there is an abnormal and excessive collection of fluid in the space between the pleural membranes. This results due to either increased production or reduced absorption of pleural fluid in the space. Pleural effusion occurs due to an underlying disease process that could be related to the respiratory system or other systems such as the CVS. Some of the common causes of pleural effusion include pneumonias, malignancies, pulmonary embolism, and congestive heart failure. The common symptoms of pleural effusion manifest as difficulty in breathing, cough, and chest pain. Other symptoms such as fever, hemoptysis, weight loss, and edema may occur and are related to underlying diseases such as pneumonia, malignancy, tuberculosis, or congestive heart failure. Coming to cyanosis, the term cyanosis means blueness of the skin, and it causes excessive amounts of deoxyhemoglobin in the skin and blood vessels, especially in the capillaries. This deoxygenated hemoglobin has an intense dark blue purple color that is transmitted through the skin. So in general, definite cyanosis appears when the arterial blood contains more than 5 grams of deoxygenated hemoglobin in each 100 ml of blood. A person with anemia almost never becomes cyanotic because there is not enough hemoglobin for 5 grams to be deoxygenated in 100 ml of arterial blood. Conversely, in a person with great excess of blood cells, such as in polycythemia vera, what happens is your RBC count increases and hence the hemoglobin content also increases. The great excess of available hemoglobin that can become deoxygenated leads frequently to cyanosis, even otherwise under normal conditions. Coming to hypercapnia, it means excess carbon dioxide in the body fluids. Hypercapnia usually occurs in association with hypoxia only when the hypoxia is caused by hypoventilation or circulatory deficiency. Hypoxia caused by too little oxygen in the air, too little hemoglobin, or poisoning of the oxidative enzymes has to do only with the availability of oxygen or use of oxygen by the tissues. Therefore, it is readily understandable that hypercapnia is not a concomitant of either anemic, atmospheric, or histotoxic hypoxia. In hypoxia resulting from poor diffusion through the pulmonary membrane or through the tissues, serious hypercapnia usually does not occur at the same time because CO2 diffuses 20 times as rapidly as O2. If hypercapnia does begin to occur, this immediately stimulates pulmonary ventilation, which corrects the hypercapnia but not necessarily the hypoxia. Conversely, in hypoxia caused by hypoventilation, CO2 transfer between the alveoli and atmosphere is affected as much as the O2 transfer. Hypercapnia then occurs along with the hypoxia. In circulatory deficiency, diminished flow of blood decreases CO2 removal from the tissues, resulting in tissue hypercapnia in addition to tissue hypoxia. However, the transport capacity of the blood for CO2 is more than 3 times that for O2, and thus the resulting tissue hypercapnia is much less than the tissue hypoxia. When alveolar PCO2 rises above about 60 to 75 mm of Hg, an otherwise normal person by then is breathing about as rapidly and deeply as he can or he or she can, and air hunger, also called dyspnea, becomes severe. If the PCO2 rises to 80 to 100 mm of Hg, the person becomes lethargic and sometimes even semi-comatose. Anesthesia and death can result when the PCO2 rises to 120 to 150 mm of Hg. At these higher levels of PCO2, the excess CO2 now begins to depress respiration rather than stimulate it, thus causing a vicious cycle. More CO2, further decrease in respiration, and even more CO2 and so forth, culminating rapidly in a respiratory death. Dyspnea means mental anguish that is associated with inability to ventilate enough to satisfy the demand for air. A common symptom is air hunger. At least 3 factors often enter into the development of sensation of dyspnea. They are abnormality of respiratory gases in the body fluids, especially hypercapnia and to a lesser extent hypoxia, amount of work that must be performed by the respiratory muscles to provide adequate ventilation, and state of mind. A person becomes very dyspneic, especially from excess buildup of CO2 in the body fluids. At times, however, the levels of both CO2 and O2 in the body fluids are normal, but to attain this normality of the respiratory gases, the person has to breathe forcefully. In these instances, the forceful activity of the respiratory muscles frequently gives the person a sensation of dyspnea. Finally, the person's respiratory functions may be normal and still dyspnea may be experienced because of an abnormal state of mind. This is called neurogenic dyspnea or emotional dyspnea. For instance, almost anyone momentarily thinking about the act of breathing may suddenly start taking breaths a little more deeply than ordinarily because of a feeling of mild dyspnea. This is greatly enhanced in people who have a psychological fear of not being able to receive a sufficient quantity of air, such as on entering smaller crowded rooms. Apnea means absence of spontaneous breathing. Occasional apneas occur during normal sleep, but in persons with sleep apnea, the frequency and duration of this apnea are greatly increased, with episodes of apnea lasting for 10 seconds or longer and occurring 300 to 500 times each night. Sleep apneas can be caused by obstruction of the upper airways, especially the pharynx, or by impaired CNS respiratory drive. Coming to obstructive sleep apnea, it is caused by blockage of the upper airway. The muscles of the pharynx normally keep this passage open to allow air to flow into the lungs during inspiration. During sleep, these muscles usually relax, but the airway passage remains open enough to permit adequate airflow. Some individuals have an extremely narrow passage, and relaxation of these muscles during sleep causes the pharynx to completely close so that air cannot flow into the lungs. In persons with sleep apnea, loud snoring and labored breathing occur soon after falling asleep. The snoring proceeds, often becoming louder, and is then interrupted by a long silent period during which no breathing occurs. These periods of apnea result in significant decreases in PO2 and increases in PCO2, which greatly stimulates respiration. This in turn causes sudden attempts to breathe, which in turn results in loud snorts and gasps, followed by snoring and repeated episodes of apnea. The periods of apnea and labored breathing are repeated several hundred times during the night, resulting in fragmented, restless sleep. Therefore, patients with sleep apnea usually have excessive daytime drowsiness as well as other disorders, including increased sympathetic activity, high heart rates, pulmonary and systemic hypertension, and a greatly elevated risk for cardiovascular disease. Obstructive sleep apnea most commonly occurs in the louder obese persons in whom there is increased fat deposition in the soft tissues of the pharynx or compression of the pharynx due to excessive fat masses in the neck. In a few individuals, sleep apnea may be associated with nasal obstruction, a very large tongue, enlarged tonsils, or certain shapes of the palate that greatly increase resistance to the flow of air to the lungs during inspiration. The most common treatments of the obstructive sleep apnea include surgery to remove excess fat tissue at the back of the throat, which is a procedure called alveopalato-pharyngoplasty, to remove enlarged tonsils or adenoids, or to create an opening in the trachea, tracheostomy, to bypass the obstructed airway during sleep, and nasal ventilation with continuous positive airway pressure, CPAP. Coming to central sleep apnea, it occurs when the neural drive to the respiratory muscles is transiently abolished. In a few persons with sleep apnea, the CNS drive to the ventilatory muscles transiently ceases. Disorders that can cause cessation of the ventilatory drive during sleep include damage to the central respiratory centers or abnormalities of the respiratory neuromuscular apparatus. Patients affected by central sleep apnea may have decreased ventilation when they are awake, although they are fully capable of normal voluntary breathing. During sleep, their breathing disorders usually worsen, resulting in more frequent episodes of apnea that decrease PO2 and increase PCO2 until a critical level is reached that eventually stimulates respiration. These transient instabilities of respiration cause restless sleep and clinical features similar to those observed in obstructive sleep apnea. In most patients, the cause of central sleep apnea is unknown, although instability of the respiratory drive can result from strokes or other disorders that make the respiratory centers of the brain less responsive to the stimulatory effects of CO2 and H plus ions. Patients with this disease are extremely sensitive to even small doses of sedatives or narcotics, which further reduce the responsiveness of the respiratory centers to the stimulatory effects of CO2. Medications that stimulate the respiratory centers can sometimes be helpful, but ventilation with CPAP, continuous positive airway pressure, at night is usually necessary. Now, coming to artificial respiration, let's talk about ventilators. Many types of respiratory ventilators are available, and each has its own characteristic principles of operation. In this figure, you can see the ventilator, which has a tank supply of oxygen or air, okay, and a mechanism for applying intermittent positive pressure, and with some machines negative pressure as well, and a mask that fits over the face of the patient, that helps in or a connector for joining the equipment to an endotracheal tube. Okay, this apparatus forces air through the mask or endotracheal tube into the lungs of the patient during the positive pressure cycle of the ventilator, and then usually allows air to flow passively out of the lungs during the remainder of the cycle. Earlier, ventilators often caused damage to the lungs because of excessive positive pressure. Their usage was at one time greatly decried. However, ventilators now have adjustable positive pressure limits that are commonly set at 12 to 15 centimeters of water pressure for normal lungs, but sometimes much higher for non-compliant lungs. Coming to tank respirator or the iron lung, here you can see the tank respirator, alright, with the patient's body inside the tank and the head protruding through a flexible but airtight collar. Okay, you can see the collar here. So at the end of the tank, opposite the patient's head, opposite the patient's head, a motor-driven leather diaphragm moves back and forth with sufficient excursion to raise and lower the pressure inside the tank. Okay, you can see the diaphragm here. So as the leather diaphragm moves inward, positive pressure develops around the body and causes expiration. As the diaphragm moves outward, negative pressure causes inspiration. Check valves on the respirator control the positive and negative pressures. Ordinarily, these pressures are adjusted so that the negative pressure that causes inspiration falls to minus 10 to minus 20 centimeters of water, and the positive pressure rises to 0 to 5 centimeters of water. Coming to the effect of ventilator and tank respirator on venous return, when air is forced into the lungs under positive pressure by a ventilator, or when pressure around the patient's body is reduced by the tank respirator, the pressure inside the lungs becomes greater than the pressure everywhere else in the body. Flow of blood into the chest and heart from the peripheral veins becomes impeded. As a result, use of excessive pressures with either the ventilator or the tank respirator can reduce the cardiac output, sometimes to less than lethal levels. Just about lethal levels. For instance, continuous exposure for more than a few minutes to greater than 30 mm of Hg positive pressure in the lungs can cause death because of inadequate venous return to the heart. Coming to oxygen therapy, the following methods are listed for oxygen therapy. By placing the patient's head in a tent that contains air fortified with oxygen, providing the patient either pure oxygen or higher concentrations of oxygen to breathe from a mask, or administering oxygen through an intranasal tube. So despite these measures, we also have hyperbaric oxygen therapy. The intense oxidizing properties of high pressure O2, that is hyperbaric oxygen, can have valuable therapeutic effects in several important clinical conditions. Therefore, large pressure tanks are now available in many medical centers into which patients can be placed and treated with hyperbaric O2. The O2 is usually administered at PO2 values of 2 to 3 atm pressure through a mask or intratracheal tube, whereas the gas around the body is normal air compressed to the same high pressure level. It is believed that the same oxidizing free radicals responsible for O2 toxicity are also responsible for at least some of the therapeutic benefits. Some of the conditions in which hyperbaric oxygen therapy has been especially beneficial are for treatment of gas gangrene. The bacteria that cause this condition, Clostridial organisms, grow best under anaerobic conditions and stop growing at O2 pressures greater than at about 70 mm of Hg. Therefore, hyperbaric oxygenation of the tissues can frequently stop the infectious process entirely and thus convert a condition that formerly was almost 100% fatal into one that is cured in most instances by early treatment with hyperbaric therapy. Other conditions in which hyperbaric O2 therapy has been either valuable or possibly valuable include decompression sickness, arterial gas embolism, carbon monoxide poisoning, osteomyelitis, and myocardial infarction.